Hello everybody, so welcome to my first video on Chile today, political and economic news from Latin America. Today I'd like to tell you about the social unrest in Chile, which you've probably been seeing a lot on the news lately. I'll begin with some data on the magnitude of the problem. Just to give you an example, so for example, 24% of the supermarkets in Chile were looted. Supermarket damages amount so far to $500 million. Damages to the subway stations amount to $300 million. We've seen a 5% drop in the stock market since October 18th. Over 2,000 detainees, protesters, 535 wounded, 18 deaths, mostly according to the Human Rights Institute, presumably 5 of them at the hand of the state agents. And the National Institute for Human Rights has presented 55 legal actions for situations that arose during the protest. So it's pretty big. I'll start by going through a chronological description of what happened, and then give you my take on what are the main causes of this and what can be done. So all this started on October 4th, when the expert panel on public transportation announced it will increase the fare of the Santiago subway, which was 800 pesos to 830, which is about $1.10 to $1.15. So this might not seem a lot by first world standards, but it's still expensive in terms of Chile and our income level here. For example, one could use the New York subway system during the entire month for approximately $120, which is approximately 5% of the minimum wage in the US. For a similar service, Chileans would have to spend 15% of the minimum wage. Okay, and the service is far away from the first world countries. For example, here most trains do not have air conditioning, and during peak hours people need to wait in line for several trains to pass before they can even get into the wagons. Okay, but in my opinion, the increase in fare is not the real or the root cause of the unrest in Chile. So it's mainly the straw that broke the camel's back. Fast forward to October 7th, in an interview to the Secretary of Economic Affairs, he was asked about the rise in the subway fare, and this was his answer: "He who gets up early will be helped." So referring to the fact that the fare was lowered for people who would travel before 7 a.m. And this is also a somewhat ironic reference to a popular saying in Spanish that goes something like, "He who gets up early, God will help him." But, well, apparently the group of students that began the protest didn't like his parody of God's word, right? So that same afternoon, they began the protest and launched what is called the first massive evasion. At that time, the evasion was limited to one station and 1 hour only. Okay, then we go to October 8th, and again, in another act of total disconnect with the real Chile, the Secretary of the Treasury, this time, Mr. Larraín, declares in reference to inflation of basic products that despite this price increase, romantic people should be happy because the price of flowers dropped by 7%. Of course, that was not taken well by the vast majority of Chileans that are struggling to make ends meet. Okay? It was a joke for the 1% elite, not for the rest of the people. Fast forward now to Monday, October 14th. The massive evasion movement started to gain traction on social media, social networks, and students from other schools start to join in. Subway stations are guarded by police and subway traffic is momentarily interrupted. That's Monday, October 14th. So Tuesday was relatively quiet. Then October 17th, Thursday, October 17th, then we have another example of total disconnect between the ruling elite and the rest of the country. This time, the president of the expert panel on public transportation states the following: that complaints on the fare increase are completely exaggerated because there are no protests when the price of bread, tomatoes, and other products increases. This was also not taken very well by the protesters because, of course, there is no substitute for the subway, but there are substitutes to the products that he mentions. But it seems that this person only goes to restaurants, right? And during the afternoon and night, protests began to get violent as more people joined the massive evasion movement. Turnpikes were destroyed and there is infrastructure damage in 10 stations. Subway services is suspended in several stations. And now we go to October 18th, that's Friday. This time it's the Secretary of Transportation that does it again. She doubles down and states that the fare will not be lowered, that the decision has been made, and of course protests increased. And by 3 p.m. line 1 and 2 of the subway were completely shut down, and by 7 p.m. the entire system was closed down, precisely when thousands of people went back to their home from work. By that time, the government called for a state of emergency. In protest, millions of people in their home start what is called a cacerolazo, which is a popular form of protest in Latin America that consists in banging pots and pans. Basically, it originated when there was food shortage and people would bang empty pots. And this is almost funny. In the meantime, during the cacerolazo, Mr. Piñera, the president, was found having pizza and wine at one of Santiago's fancy and expensive restaurants. So, this went on the social networks, they went nuts. Several subway stations got burned down, and the part of the Enel Tower, which is the headquarters of the Chilean energy company, burst in flames, and protesters loot stores. It was unseen, unprecedented in Chile. Not even during the times of Allende and Pinochet, I was told, had we seen that level of violence in our country. By Saturday morning, President Piñera declares state of exception, and the military is sent to the streets of Santiago, so for the first time since the times of Pinochet, and a curfew is declared. By now, Piñera has announced a new social pact, which is basically throwing money to the problem. He announced a large program of subsidies and price controls in an attempt to gain support from the left and the center left. Of course, this will last only for so long. But he did nothing to address the root causes of the problem. What are these root causes? I think there are basically 4 causes of this problem. The first one is the lack of economic growth. The last government statistics indicate that the growth in Chile was 2.5%, and mainly due to the reforms passed by Bachelet, but also due to the absolute inexistent political will from Piñera to overthrow those measures. Another important problem is the mass migration. So there have been 2 million people that migrated to Chile from Haiti and Venezuela in the past 5 years, many of them who came through human trafficking schemes. This has completely collapsed public services. So you have Chileans that, from the low-income groups, that have to wait in line to get public schools, for example, to get their kids into public schools, or because there are some priority for migrants, or same for home subsidies. So you have migrants that get the home subsidies and not Chileans. So there's a lot of discontent there. This mass migration also led to decreased wages, especially in the low income sector who compete for informal jobs. This made the cost of life in Santiago especially more expensive, especially rent. Santiago is today as expensive as some major European capitals, at least some parts of Santiago. But all this has benefited large corporations in the mining, construction, agriculture, retail sector, which thrive under low wages provided by this mass migration. A third cause, according to my opinion, is inequality. So not inequality in income, which is something that you hear a lot in the international press, but law inequality. There have been several corporate and corruption scandals where the accused have come out clean without any real punishment. So, for example, President Piñera, he did not pay his taxes for 30 years on his lake mansion in the south of Chile. He ended up, the Treasury announced a couple of months ago that he would only need to pay 3 of the 30 years he owed. I mean, any regular Chilean that does this would get his home liquidated after only 1 or 2 years of not paying his taxes, right? There was another case, the Penta case, where some big fishes, billionaires in Chile, were found guilty of tax evasion. The punishment was to send them to ethics class, to a business school, top business school in Chile. And on the other hand, you have small businesses that are shut down for not paying their value-added tax. So there's a complete disconnect. There are two Chiles, and I completely agree on the discontent part, and I think it's legitimate. Then you have the lack of rule of law. So for years now, there are parts of Chile and Santiago that are off hands to the state police and military, especially in the south, where under the disguise of ethical minority, terrorist groups have been killing, destroying infrastructure and private property. In Santiago, for example, there are entire neighborhoods that are taken by drug gangs. It is well known in Santiago again that when you hear fireworks, it is to announce the arrival of a new drug shipment. At that, when a drug lord dies, the police will custody his funeral. So people are tired of this. And I think those are the root causes of the discontent, and unfortunately President Piñera has done nothing to address those. This brings me to the last part of my analysis, so that yes, there is legitimate and widespread discontent. However, if you believe the mainstream media and the leftists around the world, this is like a people against the government or the military issue, and so the solution would be to remove Piñera from power. So this is far from true. First, Piñera was elected 2 years ago by a large majority, 55% of the vote, in a historical defeat for the left, especially in those sectors most affected by terrorism and drug gangs. Most Chileans support the current military and intervention and the curfew. A poll released today shows that 61% of Chileans support these measures. And finally, while the pictures of large protests with thousands of people may appear impressive, they are still a minority compared to the vast majority of people that stay home taking care of their families. Finally, let's not confuse widespread discontent and protest with coordinated and professional acts of terrorism. There were 78 simultaneous attacks on subway stations on Friday night, using the same brand of fire accelerator. It's not easy to burn a subway station. You need special fuel to do that. The headquarters of the energy company just doesn't burn in flames like that. And it's not coincidence that 2 shipments of weapons were found a few weeks ago in the north of Chile. So who is doing it? On October 16, the Organization of International States published a press release stating that there was a coordinated effort by Venezuela and Cuba to destabilize the continent. This effort would have been coordinated in the Sao Paulo Forum. So this effort started in Mexico, where last week drug cartels successfully launched an attack to free the son of drug lord Chapo Guzman. The same happened 2 weeks ago in Ecuador, where the army also had to descend as a result of protests following a fuel price increase. This and the protests in Chile led President of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, to declare that the plan is going perfect. You understand me. The goals that were set at the Sao Paulo Forum have been accomplished and we must keep up. We are doing better than expected. Finally, I think Piñera has been weak in his stance against Maduro. despite the fact that there are clear signs that Chile has been attacked by his minions. Piñera has not even expelled the Venezuelan ambassador from Chile. The lack of motivation to take a strong stance against Venezuela is a result of the support that China and Russia are giving to Maduro. Both countries have strengthened their grip on Latin America, especially China, which has been acquiring large stakes in strategic industries in Chile, including food and energy. Despite all this turmoil, it is unlikely that Trump will take any measure against this and will probably see it as a Latin American problem. In my opinion, it's time for Latin American countries to take a stronger stance against Maduro. His regime has literally flooded the continent with millions of refugees, and now his alliance with the drug cartel is destabilizing the continent. So I hope you find this information useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, share it, and welcome to comment anything you want. Goodbye.